Welcome to a brand new SPSM Chat. Hopefully, you're all seeing us live on Twitter, on Facebook, on Mixer, and the God's willing YouTube. My name is Rudy Caseres at Rudy Caseres on Twitter and Instagram, and you can also find me on Facebook and I guess YouTube. And today we're going to be talking about the opioid crisis and the links to suicide. My guests this week, Janet Schnell and Carly Larson, are going to talk about all the cool things that they do in those fields. And if you're watching this live, no matter the platform, and hopefully you're watching us live, let us know that you're here. Whether it's on Twitter, which is our home base, always will be our home base. Can't stress that enough. So hopefully you don't feel left out. If you're on Facebook, if you're on Mixer, we're on YouTube. Please let us know, especially if you're on YouTube. Hopefully our YouTube channel is back up and running. So I see Pumpkin Killer 1, so that's awesome. I wonder who that is. Let's go across the board, go on to our lovely esteemed panel. And first and foremost, let's go to Danielle and talk about what you're doing.
Hi. Oh, I am very close to the screen.
Sure
I'm
are.
Danielle. I'm going to sit right over here. So right now I'm currently working with children and families as a therapist. I've worked in the inpatient domain output. You know what? I'm not going to get into that part, but I'm currently working towards becoming a clinical psychologist, hoping to work directly with people with co-occurring disorders. I am also about to become certified as an alcohol and substance abuse counselor. I am both a lost survivor and an attempt survivor of suicide, and I'm really excited that everyone is watching us tonight.
Joelle.
Can't hear her.
Now let's go to our special guests this week. And first off, Janet Schnell. Talk about who is Janet Schnell.
Hi guys, I'm Janet Schnell, and I am a over 20-year loss survivor, suicide loss survivor. And for the past 5 years, I, as a licensed clinical social worker, have been in charge of a group for co-occurring disorders, specifically substance use disorders and in the opiate epidemic. Does that sound good?
Sure, short and sweet. Who is Carly Larson?
Hi there. I am Carly Larson. I am a non-abstinent person in recovery. I currently am the opioid response coordinator for my state crisis line. As far as suicide goes, myself had an attempt and have pretty consistent ideation since then. I think that's about all.
We have like 5 minutes. I'm used to people like going on and on. So talk about your views on abstinence because that's something that doesn't get talked about enough, Carly.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I say non-abstinent person in recovery, I do not drink. Drinking was my no-no zone. And that was actually what my suicide attempt was trying to drink myself to death. You can do it. It takes a while. I don't suggest it. So I don't drink. I'm not fully abstinent from everything, but I am in recovery. I live a really good life right now. I don't use substances problematically. More importantly, I don't feel the need to use them problematically like I used to do. So in my work, I talk a lot about abstinence not being the only option, how we are able to kind of take more control of addiction than we've kind of been led to believe. And that cross addiction isn't actually as widespread and prevalent as we were led to believe. So yeah.
Janet, can you talk more about your background and why this is an important issue to you?
Do you care if I do that disclaimer first?
Sure. Oh, yes. Go for it, please.
So all the views expressed during this podcast is mine alone. I do work for an opiate recovery center called Groups Recovers Together, but everything that I'm sharing is my own opinion expressed at this time. Um, for over 5 years, I have, as a social worker, been in charge of groups, talking about group topics, and so I really enjoy the group format as opposed to individual therapy. And I have previously it was co-occurring. This one is specifically opiate epidemics, or sorry, the opiate addiction. And I'm the what I always call is the facilitator of the discussion. And so we run evidence-based programs talking about specific topics that is regarding why people got to this point where they needed to seek help. So the agency I currently work for does prescribe Suboxone, and that's a hot topic when it comes to is that replacing one drug with another drug. And that's a whole nother issue itself as to what my opinion and what research has actually shown along with that.
Okay, so let's check in on the Twitter chat. Use the hashtag SPSM on every tweet that you make so I can see it. Jeanette Tolson says, "Yay, Carly! I love thinking of recovery as a buffet of options, and we decide what goes on our plate." Jess Stolman Rainey up in the house. I appreciate you. She is part of the Junior is Here fan club. In case those are wondering, the Junior is Here is Carly. Spoiler alert. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate you, Lena, as well. I appreciate you, Jeanette. Um, I love the UBSSW gang. You all are amazing. Hey, Krista Marie, who's also moderating the Twitter chat to make sure that she retweets and gives amplification to all of you lovely human beings. And again, thank you, Lena. And we're a couple minutes early, but you know what? We tend to go over time anyway. So let's get to our first question. And that first question is, how has the rise in opiate-related deaths changed how we see suicide? And I say opiate, but this is opioid is more general term that's used, especially specifically when it comes to the crisis. So excuse me when I say opiate. It's more of an opiate crisis, but Janet and Carly can much better clarify that than me. So let's go to Janet and get your take on this question.
When you think about the opiate related, the rise, is that I think that it's something me and my field has been like, that's a dumb moment that we didn't need research to show that when we had the opiate crisis, what I had seen happen specifically was that people were prescribed medication for pain. And then all of a sudden there was this big scare because they realized it was addictive. And then we had doctors who took people off of all pain medication. And then they're left then to, oh, what now? What do I do? I need help. I have chronic pain. And there was nothing that they had to be able to follow up with. So lost all hope, had no reason to live. And of course, then the next thought is the suicide. And so for a long time, I knew we needed to take this seriously, that I could see the connection between pain and suicide. It's just research is now showing up to show what we've known for a long time.
Carly?
Yeah, so first comment, opiates are organic, opioids are synthetic, and opioids will include the organic ones.
Thank
so that
you.
is the umbrella term. Anyways, so as far as seeing like the rise in opioid, while part of the narrative and part of what happened was prescriptions getting cut off, we really just saw an overall rise in substance use and a rise in heroin use. And not all of that was prescriptions being cut off, kind of like this narrative has led us to believe. Part of the reason that narrative was so widespread is because it was meant to build empathy, because that's what we needed to see people who use drugs as human beings in this country. So we're here now, right? What I really see with the rise in the opioid crisis and the rise in suicide, or how that changed, or that's the suicide, sorry, is just people in a lot of pain, whether that's physical, whether that's mental. People not wanting to be a part of the reality they're currently a part of. And I see that with substance use and especially with suicide, just not wanting to be a part of what I'm in right now. I don't want to feel this way. I don't want to think this way. I don't want to be kind of stuck in this wheel. I think what's fortunate about the opioid crisis, and we have to remember that a big part of the reason that we're talking about the opioid crisis and we're talking about people who use drugs in respectful tones is because middle-class white people started dying. People have been dying from opioids for a very long time. There have been really high overdose rates for a while. They just weren't in the population we're seeing. However, now we're starting to see kind of wanting to help people who use drugs. And in that, I think we are also starting to see people wanting to help people who are thinking about suicide, and it's not pushing them away as much anymore, and it's not belittling them or calling them addicts. I think we're starting to come across a more holistic approach that I think is really helpful. I think overall, just people are in pain, and we need to fix what the source of the pain is.
Now let me ask you, Carly, what do you prefer to addict? I don't like that word either, but I want to make sure that people watching who may have no background at all, and that's the only word they know, what is some terminology that you prefer?
Yeah, so really, people who use drugs is kind of the blanket term. If you want to talk about, you can say problematic substance use. There are some people who aren't as comfortable with that. I tend to say problematic substance use. Substance misuse is one. Again, a lot of these terms have fans and haters, and it's sometimes really hard to keep up with. So people who use drugs problematically, I think might be a really good blanket term to include here.
Okay, let's go to Danielle. There we go. Hey, Danielle.
I just remembered to unmute myself.
That's
So
totally
I
fine.
like a lot of what the two of you said, and I feel like one of the terms that I notice people get uncomfortable with is I have substance use disorder. So I just thought that I would throw that out there. I think one of the problems that I've noticed is that, like you had kind of said similar, I think that I just froze. Am I freezing? I'm freezing. But I feel like a lot of people see them as independent issues. Like this is just depression and this is just substance use disorder. And I can tell you in my experiences working in the hospitals with detoxing and just having friends who are using substances, friends who passed away by suicide, is that I've never met an addict who is happy. I've never met an alcoholic who is happy. So going back to what Carly had said, I think it's important that you tackle both issues, but I also know that there is also, you have to tackle one before you can tackle the others. So there's an order with that. So I know that it's a lot harder for people to see clearly that, self-medicating is a slow form of suicide. I know that I shared with you guys prior to the show that I've lost somebody who actually actively made their suicide plan with opiates and follow through on that. So I just feel like we need to see the bigger picture and see that, it's all connected. I just have to go back to what I said before, is that I've just never met a happy addict. Not every addict or person using substances is going to be suicidal, but there's something that the substance use is masking, in my opinion. So I don't know where you guys just went. What is happening?
Joelle.
Sorry, I
Let's go back to Danielle. Let's see. Hey, Danielle, are you back?
I'm back.
Cool, cool. Did you get in everything that you wanted to say during that?
Yeah, I just feel like the main thing that I've noticed is that we see these as two separate issues. There's people who are educated on what to look for with suicide, and then everybody has this. I mean, not everybody, but a lot of people have a very narrow-minded view on addiction, and I see that people have these two different opinions instead of noticing that they kind of are always connected. Um, and I don't know if this was the part that chopped out when my internet had a little fart there. But I was just saying that I've never interacted with someone who's using substance or alcohol who was not using it to self-medicate. And I mean, this is going, in my personal life and also to when I was working in an inpatient facility. It's usually 9 out of 10 times a co-occurring issue. There's depression and alcoholism. There's bipolar disorder and heroin addiction. It's just something that I personally have always seen that there was a big correlation to. Not every one of them was suicidal, but most of them were. So that was what I hope you guys could hear the first go around. So
No, definitely, and I appreciate that. Let's see what the Twitter chat has to say. Yeah, I'm sorry we're having issues with Joelle's audio as well. We're on location right now. So, so Lena Hellman says, thanks. So opioids can be either organic or synthetic, umbrella term, and opioids are only organic. Hopefully Carly did a good job of clarifying that, but if you want to add anything to that, Carly, go for it. Jess says, regarding the juniors here comments on question one, I think it really, really important that we recognize how white supremacy has impacted of our sudden collective investment in and awareness of the opioid crisis. I'm going to let you, Carly, respond to that. Let me just make sure we have any more. Can someone quote the junior? Yes, Krista, if you get a chance, can you quote that as well? If not, that's totally fine. I know we're going a mile a minute. So, Carly, what say you to that, to Jess's comment?
I fully support it. I retweeted it. I think when we look at the response to drug use in this country and when we look at problematic drug use, it has been very much dependent on who is using drugs. So if we go back to the history of opioids in this country, we look in 1870 when everybody was getting prescribed morphine. If you were a white middle-aged woman, you were leaving the doctor's office with a morphine prescription, no matter what you came in for. And that was actually where doctors started noticing addiction, was in middle-class white women. And so they were like, oh, we're going to do a holistic approach. We're going to help these women. They're obviously in pain, and we're going to figure out what to do. Fast forward a couple years, a couple decades, is when you started seeing lower class immigrants using opium. And so like opium dens were a really big deal. So then what happens? The Harrison Act, where we decide we're going to criminalize opium use and morphine use instead of how it was when rich white women were using it. I think we're seeing the same thing now, where it took kids dying in the suburbs to get people to notice that like drug addiction can really impact anybody. It cuts across socioeconomic lines. It cuts across class lines. However, we criminalize it when it's people of color, and we treat it as a mental health approach, a medical approach, when it's people who are white.
Let's get to question number 2, and that is, are you ready? Do you think opioid-related deaths are being reported accurately of overdose versus suicide? Let's go to Janet. Unmute your mic.
Sorry. I'm sorry. Say that question again.
Do you think opioid-related deaths are being reported accurately of overdose versus suicide?
Of course not. There's no way that we could be accurately reporting. Many times people don't even want to have the list or the ruling as a suicide death because of the stigma associated with it, let alone the double stigma as a drug overdose. So we're going to hide it as much as we possibly can, just because people can get on and find out the information about why someone died and actually see what their cause would be. So no, I don't think that it is. It's all related to stigma.
Let's go to Carly, and then we'll go to Danielle.
Yeah, so this is a really big deal, especially in the work I'm doing, is how deaths involving substance use and suicide are rarely accurately reported. We are missing so much data that I actually feel would be really beneficial for us. So no, they're not getting reported. I do agree that part of that is stigma. Honestly, part of that is also funding. I'm in a lot of rooms with coroners who are just like, we run out of our money in our fiscal year really early. And when that money's out, we don't do toxicology reports. I think this is also very prevalent when you have children or people under the age of 18 who are dying of an overdose, because parents are able to kind of dictate what happens in the autopsy. And a lot of the times you don't want to know what your kid's doing, or like Janet said, you don't want that information getting out.
Danielle. Dr. Glick, I'm sorry.
Dr. Glick, thank you. Thank you for correcting yourself. No, I'm just kidding. I agree with the both of you. I think that there's a huge problem. I know that in my area, there's been a lot of overdose suicides. These are things where they've found, suicide notes and blah, 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 blah. In my own personal experiences, I know for a fact that one of my friends, his death was reported as an overdose when in fact he had been talking about taking his life for 2 weeks prior. And there was a suicide attempt 2 weeks before he actually succeeded. And I feel like because of the way that things are viewed regarding substance use, it's easier to just kind of push it to the side and be like, no, this is what kind of death it was, and why bother investigating any further? And for me, one thing that I personally think is very important is kind of finding out what else was going on. I've dealt with and worked with many people who have had very clear, very strong suicidal ideation, who were also using substances, and the substance was all that was paid attention to. So when they did succeed, down the road in taking their lives, they were just looked at as a person who is using heroin or whatever it was that they chose. And it kind of diminished everything else. The fact that they were depressed and nobody was there to support them, the fact that they were treated like, I hate this term more than anything in the world, but they were treated like junkies rather than people who needed help. And that's something that really pisses me off. And I feel like that feeds into the fact that it's not being reported properly. And like you just stated, there's the issues of like coroners and toxicology reports. So how is there a clear way to actually determine what's what without any of the background information?
Carly, do you have a little bit more to say?
Yeah, I've actually been looking into intentional overdoses too. And I think what I've found is there is such a gray zone when it comes to that line between like overdose and suicide, like overdose and intentional overdose. There's also been a lot of work of the people in the moment, like truly not knowing what their level of intent was. So I think we can sit there post incident and say, okay, this was an intentional overdose or this was just an accidental overdose. But oftentimes on the other side of that, as it's happening, the person themselves don't even really know whether they're intentionally doing it or not. And I think that's something that needs to be looked into more. It's something I'm looking into more. I don't think that there's an easy answer. I'm not sure if there necessarily needs to be an easy answer. I don't know how our response would change if we had more knowledge of like, oh, these were intentional overdoses or these were just accidental. Like, I think our models that's not that is not what they need to respond to.
Janet, do you have follow-up comments?
Yeah, please. I am a certified psychological autopsy investigator, and so I call BS on the whole term, we don't have enough money to do the investigation, because there are people out there who are certified to be able to do this. We're just not being asked to help, and we can't just intrude upon and help define. I think what we look for is the number one reason why someone dies, and that's it. And if we're able to identify that number one, no one looks at other possibilities of why people are dying by suicide.
Do you have any follow-up comments, Carly?
No, I think, getting into the why, again, I don't think it's necessarily super pertinent from a behavioral health side, I should say, for us to know if it was intentional or not. Either way, their use or their wanting to die or they're wanting to numb the pain is just that. They are wanting to numb some kind of pain.
Let's take it to the Twitter chat. And let's see if anyone else. I'm sure Jess has some comments. Let's get to I think it's question number one. Dr. Amanda says suicides and drug overdoses kill twice the number of Americans today as 2 decades ago. We need to invest resources to address the overlap of these major public health concerns. Leah says to answer to question number two, in addition to suicide, I've been hearing that people are overdosing women as murder, and it often gets ruled as an accidental overdose. That's something that we can really talk about for a long, long time. Future episode, maybe we'll have Leah Harris on to talk about that. Jeanette says, I don't think there is a standard way of accounting for either. Dr. Amanda says, suicides are often underreported and further underreported when substances aren't involved. Leah says, what do y'all think of this term, deaths of despair? I think it's problematic and obscuring who is causing the despair. Actually, anyone want to reply to that? Carly does. Unmute your mic.
Yes. So from like a not serious perspective, I actually really find death of despair like this romantic ideal. I kind of think of like a Victorian woman in literature. But I really enjoyed the comment that it's not saying who is causing the despair. When we say death of despair, we are saying that person just had so much pain inside of them and they couldn't handle it, versus the world is a really oppressive place. And this world had layers upon layers of things they were doing to this person. So again, it's kind of that like individual versus outer model.
Let us go back to the Twitter chat, see if I missed anything, and then we'll get to question number three. Jess says, I don't think we are accurately capturing suicide or opiate deaths, but I wonder why this question is so important to us. I feel like I hear people asking this all the time. And you know what? Let's see if anyone has a response to that. Janet or Carly? How about you, Carly?
I mean, I agree. I don't think it changes anything from our end. I think at the end of the day, whether somebody's using substances, dying by suicide, or mixing both of them, that isn't the point. The point is what is causing this need for problematic use, for needing to get out of the reality that you're currently experiencing. And us having an answer, if it's an overdose, if it's a suicide, doesn't do anything for that. It just gives us answers. That's all it is. It just makes us want to feel good and collect data and be able to give money to the people responding to substance use or the people responding to suicide. Like, as we said, these things get very separated out, and we just want to decide who gets money instead of, supporting the whole enchilada.
Rudy, can I say
Janet?
something?
Sure.
Sorry. For me, in a group perspective, it helps for me because we talk about it in the group process and people realize they're not alone. That when we start talking about what started the addiction and then get to the point of the suicidal thoughts, people feel like they're still alone in their own thoughts. But when we talk about it in a group process, they realize they're not alone and they have someone to identify with. So it's not just about research.
Let's go to question number 3, and we can maybe circle back to any of these topics towards the end as well, because we're kind of breezing through this, which is good. We're having a good conversation. Question number 3. How can opiate addiction lead to someone to being actively suicidal? And we'll go back to you, Janet.
So a couple different instances. One could be that, and it was a question I had asked earlier also, is that what I see among group members for me is that it was a crisis, a depression, anxiety, a trauma that started first, and emotionally couldn't handle that part. So this had nothing to do with pain. This was the emotional pain, not the physical pain. And that then led to the addiction, because they found a pill fixed it. A pill helped them so that they didn't have to have those feelings. And so that's what I'm looking more at. What started it first? What started the addiction first? And a great majority of the people that I help, it was the emotional impact that started the addiction.
What say you, Carly?
So this is something I'm exploring right now, and it comes from my own experience of like, when does suicidal ideation and intent go from passive to active within the realm of substance use? So for me, with opiate addiction, as far as any other addiction, it's again not wanting to experience reality as it currently is. So when I think of opiate addiction, physical pain, but also mental pain. And part of addiction is not just that physical dependency, it's that desire, compulsive urge, yada, yada. And so I kind of see it as like you get stuck in this realm of wanting to keep numbing yourself and wanting to keep not experiencing reality. And eventually you realize, like, oh, there's a really great way that I could just not experience reality right now. Suicide. That is the ultimate way to just check myself out currently, presently. I don't have to deal with the cycle of using pills, with the cycle of reemergence of pain, whether that's physical or mental. I get to take myself off the chessboard. I don't have to play this game anymore. So I think when we're not looking at the issues that lead up to that, and when we're not looking at a way to take away the pain, that we can't be upset when somebody doesn't want to experience their reality anymore.
Danielle?
So it's funny because I've basically had experiences that are kind of a combination of both of the things that you both said. But like Janet, mostly my interactions with people, it stems from a place of emotional pain, and it stems from trying to numb the pain. And I feel like a lot of the people who have opened up to me about when it went from, point A to point B was they don't even know, because they were so dependent on numbing the pain and so avoidant of facing their reality that when they started to think about the suicidal plans and whatnot, it kind of just appeared. So they don't even know when they began and when they developed into I'm going to take action. And unfortunately, with the people that I've personally lost, it's not like I can have a conversation or go back in time and try to figure out that point for them. But I know that there was a couple of people who had told me that they started to become actively suicidal when they realized, or felt rather, that they had absolutely no control over their addiction. And that was the point where we would be like, but you do have control, because that's step one is, you're powerless to your addiction. So I feel like, like I say, every single SPSM chat, I think everything is very important to look at individually, because one person's reasons for getting from going from passive to actively suicidal is going to be different from the next person's. And that also goes to the reason behind why they became addicted to opiates in the first place. So
Now let me ask you, Danielle, have you ever gotten so dumps in the downs where you've considered drug use?
Okay. So my first suicide attempt came when I was 13 years old, and that was unsuccessful. My second suicide attempt was through pills. In recent years, it has crossed my mind. My last suicide attempt was in 2015. But to me, based on the circumstances and the level of basically despair, I like that word that was used in that tweet. The level of despair I felt, it was kind of like a more violent, quick means to an end rather than something like taking pills. But yes, in the past, I have encountered that. But because of my failed attempt and because of the inability for me to get the drugs that I actually wanted to do, to try and die by suicide with them, were so completely unavailable to me. I had actually reached out to a friend when I was about 15 years old who I knew was actively using opiates, and had asked her if she could get me some. And she was like, "You are absolutely never touching this stuff." it's not going to happen. And, to this day, I've never touched an opiate. I've broken bones and refused opiate medication. Because from 2014 to 2015, I buried about 9 people to opiate use. And some of those were intentionally, like, suicide note left behind. So that's why this is kind of a very sensitive topic to me right now, because of my own personal experiences with my friends and with the people that I've lost, that I've worked, trying to help them find recovery.
Well, I'm glad you're here, Dr. Glick. I'm glad you feel like we're all family here on SPSM Chat.
You guys are my family.
Yes. Now, I know Janet has some additional comments, so let's hear from Janet.
Just listening to what everyone was saying, the other thing that crossed my mind is that when things started being classified as an opiate epidemic, we had people who thought that there was only one pathway to be able to beat the addiction. And what we know is that what works for one doesn't work for everyone. And so we started to narrow the field of what we thought was acceptable for treatment, not realizing that that if they can't successfully, we'll say, detox completely off of all medication, that's the only way to do it. It's not. We have to have many different venues to help people with the addiction, and also then realize that when we try to narrow the field down, that's when I see the increase in the suicidal thoughts, because they tried one program, they weren't able to succeed, and then they lost hope.
Do you have any follow-up comments, Carly?
Actually, I don't.
Awesome. Let's take it to the Twitter chat, because I know they do. So Jess says there is certainly overlap between substance use and suicide, but I also think some biased/discriminatory views about substance use make people overemphasize the connection. Jess also says this is even more complicated when we consider the possibility that substance use might be a harm reduction practice for people who are in suicide crisis, but that's not something that anyone really seems to want to think or talk about. Lena says, I appreciate Carly's point that the line between intentional and unintentional is often unclear, including for the person with the unintention. Binary belief systems rarely hold up in real life. Leia says, I love you and all the things you say, Carly, and happy freaking birthday to you. Happy birthday, Carly. Unmute your mic, and I have a feeling that you might have some responses to some of the comments by Lena and Jess.
Yes. First of all, Leia, I love you too. I want to go back to Jess's. I just need to find it. Hang on. This is awkward. I apologize.
You got it? I can read it too if you want.
I think it was like the first or second one you read.
Okay, so is it about there is certainly overlap between substance use and suicide, but I also think some biased discriminatory views about substance use make people overemphasize the connection. Was that the right one you're thinking of?
Yes, and I think this goes back, and Danielle, I'm going to politely disagree with you. I think this is something I hear a lot in my field that I disagree with a lot, that addiction is inherently suicidal, or that addiction is suicidal in some manner. I don't think many people get into addiction with the hope of ever wanting to die. I don't think that that cycle always leads to suicidal ideation at all. And it's something I hear a lot. I hear that people who use drugs don't value their life, or they are not wanting to participate in society as a productive member, or that they are fine killing themselves slowly. And for a lot of us, that's just not accurate. A lot of us weren't okay killing ourselves slowly, but also drugs aren't as bad for you as everybody says. Opiates are a lot different. There's obviously overdose threats with everything, but a glass of wine isn't going to be a huge health defect. A line of cocaine isn't going to be a huge health defect. And so we have put this moralistic tone to drug use that's it is unhealthy, and it is incredibly unhealthy. And even if you use a little bit, that means you don't care about your life. So I think kind of that stigmatizing belief system around people who use drugs, that it's not always suicidal. And then for some of us, it becomes suicidal. But then again, like for me, I wrestled with my existence from the age of 5. So it was only a matter of time before that was really going to come out in a way that I could name it. I think the things surrounding addiction, of not having a support system, of not being able to get off a drug that you want to get off and stuff like that does lead to suicide. I don't think that being a drug user, being a person who is addicted to drugs or problematic use is going to be suicidal all the time.
Did you have any response, or would you guys want to go to question number 4?
Can I just quickly respond?
Sure.
I wasn't trying to make it seem like that was all of the interactions I've had. I generally work in acute care. And so these are people who are in the midst of crisis. This is stuff that I've experienced. Not all of them are. So I'm sorry if I did come across making it sound like that, because that's not something that I fully believe. I don't believe that every person who's battling with alcoholism or addiction is inherently suicidal. I'm catching them at their moment where they are actively suicidal. And I think I should have clarified that a little bit better. So I just felt like I needed to put that out there. And I do agree with you. Like I was just scrolling through the Twitter feed too. And I saw someone who had tweeted, Dr. Amanda tweeted about PTSD. And that is part of the reason, with my own personal experiences that have led me to my suicide attempts and, previous drug use. As of today, I'm completely sober. But I was a heavy user for many, many years. I was a drinker. I'm coming up at the end of this month, it'll be 9 years without alcohol. And I think that a lot of the people that I've interacted with in these moments of crisis, if I'm not mistaken, did have that diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. So just to clarify it again, I'm working with a specific population, and this is a big reason that they're coming and seeking the help that I've been able to provide for them. So I needed to put that out there.
Let's get to question number 4, and we can always circle back if we have time. And that question number 4, is the war on drugs a major contributor to the current opioid crisis? And let's go to Janet.
Why are you always starting with me first? I want to hear what other people have to say. Can I pass for now and let me hear what other people have to say?
Sure. That's totally fine. And I want to address Kevix's question on Facebook. We did touch a little bit upon that about the class issue. Are you able to see that comment, Carly? Okay, cool. Your mic is unmuted.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted.
So yeah, no, you might have come in late, but Carly really explained that well. So when you get a chance, just watch the replay and check that out. So question number 4, let's try this again. And this is to Carly. Is the war on drugs a major contributor to the current opioid crisis?
Yes, in a nutshell.
That's going to do it for SPSM Chat tonight.
And I'm done. All right, so what I am noticing, what people in behavioral health have been saying for years, yada, 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 is like, when you take away one drug, one's going. When we look at the war on drugs, we see it not
Carly, sorry, you broke up a second.
Okay.
Can you repeat that again?
Yeah. How far back?
Just one sentence.
Okay, I don't remember what the sentence was
anymore.
Just go over. All right, so when we look at the war on drugs, we saw like a massive criminalization of drug use, but only for specific populations, specifically Black people, specifically immigrants. And so that created a whole bunch of issues in those communities, right? And that created a lot of pain, a lot of trauma, and a lot of different situations that we know lead up to addiction. I know that part of the narrative of the opioid crisis is when you took prescription pills away, then heroin popped up. And part of that is true. And that also just kind of, heroin's like been up and down in our society since the 70s, kind of. I'm getting off track. All right. So take one drug off the street, another one's going to pop up. Right now, what we are saying is fentanyl is being the massive driver of overdoses, right? And why is fentanyl all of a sudden a huge deal in our streets? Because we started cracking down on heroin. And so the problem is we're taking off these drugs that we know what they do. People know the safe amount they can use. And now we have these synthetic drugs coming in, such as fentanyl, where people aren't used to the amount, don't know how much. And this is true of so many other drugs we see across. Like when acid got taken off the street, we started seeing all these synthetics that were fatal for some people. When MDMA got criminalized, then we started seeing all these synthetics that, again, were fatal. Even cannabis has had the same thing with like K2 and spice. So our reactions to drugs and trying to just take away the drug and trying to criminalize people is not tackling the issues of addiction. And if we don't tackle the issues of addiction, and if we don't tackle what leads up to those, we're just going to keep having a different crisis. Right now, we're having a stimulant crisis, or arguably Colorado, we've always been really big on stimulants. It's actually, according to many, has kind of been our number one concern even during this opioid crisis. But we keep just trying to take away the drug. And that's what the whole war on drugs is taking away the drug, but it's not taking away any of the problems. People are just going to find another drug to do, because if you're not taking away the pain, if you're not taking away the things that lead up to problematic use, it's still going to be there. And then there's the whole other like side conversation on how the war on drugs has like created a massive colonialism, imperialism mark in other countries, but that's a different chat.
Now, let me ask you, Carly, to kind of give like the super, super Cliff Notes version of the war on drugs, because this was a thing that was created like in the 80s, right? So there might be people watching this who weren't even born then. So if you can kind of give like the very, very short summary of what the war on drugs is, that'd be awesome.
Yeah. So basically, Nixon, you know, that president that's coming back up into our topic of conversations lately, really wanted to clean the streets. And so basically there's this whole movement where this is also where you start seeing like Just Say No become a really big deal with Nancy Reagan. This is kind of the origin of the DARE programs that research has shown were really big failures. I got an award in DARE, if that tells you anything. So basically, it was just criminalizing drug use, but really specific ways. So the war on drugs has led to a lot of like post-legal, I cannot think, legislative bills So like one example is like Coke will get you a little bit of time in prison, but if you have crack, it's like 10 times the amount of time in prison. So it just created like targeting drugs, wanting to take them off. And as it's gone on, the DEA has responded to different drugs, but then new drugs come out because people do drugs and it just doesn't work. That was short. I'm sorry.
No. People needed to hear that. Let's go to Danielle and then we'll go to Janet.
I was muted, sorry.
That is the theme of tonight.
What did you say?
Go on, sorry.
There was just so many things that Carly was saying that I wanted to jump off of, and then you raised another point, and then there was something else I wanted to say, so I feel like I lost my train of thought. But one thing that did stick out to me was the criminalization of people using substance abuse and substances. I feel like my brain is starting to shut down for the night. But that's like one area that this whole war on drugs like really pisses me off. So I know from my own sobriety that I wasn't able to change because people wanted me to change. You couldn't force me to stop drinking. You couldn't force me to stop smoking PCP. I had to get to that point on my own. And I feel like this whole thing is trying to force people by criminalizing them, like throwing people who need help into jail is not going to do anything except for introduce them to more people who can introduce them to worse and stronger drugs. So that's like the biggest point of contention I have with this whole issue and everything that Carly had raised. And that's literally the only thing that keeps replaying in my mind right now. But I feel like maybe things would be a little bit better if we had more options and opportunity for people to get help should they want it, rather than treating everyone like a criminal. So I'm going to remember all of this stuff at 2:00 in the morning that I actually wanted to say in response to this question. And
That's why we have SPSM after hours. So,
do we? I think we should start that.
yes. What say you, Janet Schnell, master social worker? What is this? Still question 4? Jesus.
Do you know, I was thinking about again that when with the war on drugs is that it's always supposed to be abstinence based, and we already know abstinence based doesn't work. And I felt like that there's quite a few things that we missed out on, that what works for one doesn't work for another. It's when people are identifying that substance use is taking over their life, that they're not able to have a functioning life, they're not able to have a job, a good relationship within their family, and then they're identifying that they need help. And then they're given the only option of, well, then you'll have to be completely clean and sober, and you can use nothing, and don't realize that there are a lot of other options. But we need to go back to find out what first started the addiction. What was the beginning? What was it that you were trying to hide from emotionally? And then also look at the chronic pain.
Any follow-up, Carly, before we get to final thoughts?
Yeah, I think one thing I noticed that's important to remember, and I know we're kind of talking about addiction, but like there are also just people who use drugs that don't use them problematically. Actually, most people who use drugs never develop an addiction. And I think what we really saw with the war on drugs at that time and what has carried on is just that drugs are bad. Anyone who uses drugs are bad. There's no safe usage, hence the abstinence only. It's really just this demonizing of drug users. So then when someone does have a problem with their drug use or does need a little support, it took us a very long time to see them as not an inherently bad person. We are just now starting to be like, as a whole country, for the most part, people who use drugs shouldn't die just because they use drugs. That's new. That hasn't happened, because if you use drugs, you were a bad person, you were a criminal. So that's also something that like doesn't get talked about, because we tend to talk about worst case scenario and addiction, but that like people use drugs non-problematically. And if they do need help, then we just need to be there for them.
Okay, so let's take it to the Twitter chat, and then we'll do final thoughts and take it home. So sadly, we won't be able to respond to all of these, but keep on tweeting, keep using that hashtag SPSM. Even if you're watching this later on the day, later on the week, that's totally fine. Grace says, I don't know if my final thought should be on DBT, but I'm irked that not more research dedicated to correlation between suicide and addiction, other than speculation of drug symptom-induced hopelessness. But I don't know if it's okay to say that. It's okay here. This is totally a safe space, Grace, and I mean that with sincerity. Lena says, I saw these commercials when I was a kid. I understood them. Let's read Leia's tweet about the commercials. Just says, I think anytime we make an assumption about people's experience based on correlated data, we get into dangerous territory. And I saw your tweet about the psychological autopsy, Jess, and don't worry, we're going to do a whole episode about that. We'll get there. We might even have you on. Leia says, out with abstinence-based anything and in with harm reduction. Jeanette says, the war on drugs was never a good solution to the struggle with substances. You know, is there anyone on this Twitter chat who thought that was a good idea? I want to hear you, okay? I want to hear what you have to say and defend yourself. SPS Cliff Notes, War on Drugs. Oh, that's a good name for a movie. Leia says, I'm kind of old and came of age during the Scared Straight era. I've seen that. And this is your brain on drugs. Frying pan commercials. So much fun. Yes, indeed. Jess says, War on Drugs is a moralistic campaign that criminalized substance users, specifically targeting, I believe that is by people of color. Is that right, Carly? The BIPOC.
Black Indigenous people of color.
Okay, awesome. Okay, I totally got it wrong. Leading to mass
Some of them might be bi, though.
Yes. Krista says, honestly, it reminds me of my experiences with self-harm too. There are so many times that I self-harm instead of killing myself. Do I recommend it? Absolutely not. Do I regret the one thing that kept me alive when it was all I had? Honestly, no, I don't. That is a future SPSM episode. You guys are giving away all the spoilers. Grace, off topic, but what a freaking hard SPSM chat tonight. You know what? You are right, Grace, but these are important conversations to have, and I can totally get that this can be triggering to some people. And if you got to take a time off from the chat, that's totally fine as well. But I sincerely believe that conversations like this are very, very important. Desiree says, "Yeah, I believe that's a pretty big stream of income for AAS." Well, let's end it there on the Twitter chat before we start offending even more people. So, final thoughts. Let's get on to final thoughts with Danielle.
Final thoughts. What I think is really funny. So I noticed, this is really random, but I noticed in all of our SPSM chats, I'm flailing my hands around every single time I talk. So tonight I decided that I was going to keep a pen in my hand to try and stop doing that. And I just realized that it's the Serenity Prayer. And I thought it was pretty ironic for the topic. But I want everyone to look at people, whether they're suicidal, whether they're addicted to opiates or anything, and recognize that they're people and they're hurting too when we stigmatize and judge them. And if you have nothing helpful to say, maybe try a different approach and listen to them, because I know that a lot of people at the end of the day, whether they're actively suicidal or not, just need to be heard. So try not to judge if it's a place that you can't understand, and maybe take a couple of minutes to try and educate yourself on what they're going through and have a conversation with them. Ask them what they need. I know that I have friends who are currently in recovery, and I'm not afraid to ask them, just as they're not afraid to ask me, are you feeling like using? What can we do to get you through this moment? So, the one day at a time thing is really, really important. And I hope anyone out there that is watching this that is struggling with addiction, and is not quite ready to find their sobriety, I hope that you get to that point. There is help out there, and there is hope to get through this, and with suicidal ideation.
Carly?
Yeah, so I think I always say being a human being is really hard. And I think people do whatever they need to make it through their day. And for some of us, that is a little more socially accepted, and for some of us, less so. I think when it comes to substance use and suicide, like either way, it is just somebody not wanting to experience their current reality. And so instead of asking the individual, like, how can you change? What can we change about the world for them? What can we change in our society to make it a little bit easier for all of us? Because all of us are struggling. Why? Why are we still within this world where everybody is struggling? Why aren't we changing something? Also, harm reduction works. Everybody should carry Narcan. And I did all of this on cold medicine, so I'm pretty proud of myself.
And let me ask you, Carly, what are some organizations, some nonprofits we can donate and show our support?
Yeah, so I'm going to be a little biased. I'm in Colorado. The Harm Reduction Action Center is a huge deal in Colorado. It's across the street from our capital. They provide people who use drugs with clean needles, any clean cooking materials, treatment connections if they need it. Their board is all made of people who use drugs, so they're really for them. Rocky Mountain Crisis Partners, always a good one to do.
The Reagan administration.
Nancy Reagan Memorial of Cornflakes, maybe? I feel like all of those went together. Like we said, nobody should. Okay, Cornflakes is a different chat. Sorry.
Janet, final thoughts.
As a suicide loss survivor, I want to take it back to the whole perspective of it affects everybody, and that we need to really take this seriously. We need to look at what brings on what I call psychache, or is known as psychache. And as a licensed clinical social worker, that we really need to do better at helping others. And so, broadband perspective, what led me into the whole field of helping people with substance use disorders was that I became a loss survivor first, and I saw that people were dying by suicide. And one reason was because of this whole opiate epidemic. And so we need to be able to take everything seriously and let you know that you're not alone. That's really right. I like the group process because in a group, you find out that someone else is also struggling with something very similar to what you're struggling with.
Do you have any final thoughts, Joelle? Do you want to come over here? Okay. No, that's totally fine. But thank you, Joelle. Yeah. Let me give you my final thoughts.
I did a rant in there,
yeah. Go read Joelle's rants on Twitter. My final thoughts are this: ain't nothing wrong with a little bit of crack. That's going to do it for that's going to do it for this week's SPSM Chat. Thank you so much for joining us. Next week, Sunday, October 27th, our guest will be Dr. Jesse Gold. Stay tuned. Check out the SPSM Twitter account, Facebook account, YouTube account, and Mixer account. Thank you for everyone who joined us on Mixer as well. Anxiety, Marie will be back next week, so your hero is going to return to us, and it'll be a good one. So make sure to follow those social media accounts to stay updated with topics we'll be discussing with Dr. Gold. So thank you all. I appreciate you all. See you next week. Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Carly. Thank you, Joelle. Thank you, Danielle Glick, Dr. Glick, and until next week, hold your piggies close.